So BP debating is the type of debating we do in second semester. Most people will be used to 3-on-3 debating like we did in first semester, and I'm going to assume with this session that most people are familiar with that. So you're familiar with what we call a topic, the different sides, affirmative and negative, and generally how debates go. If any of that doesn't make sense at any stage, if I use words or jargon that people don't understand, just stick your hand up, interrupt me, no worries. You can ask questions at any stage. But yeah, so we do a different style of debating in second semester, and this is just outlining how it works. At the end of the day, you're still debating, you've still got to persuade people, so it's nothing crazily different. This is just an explanation of the different structure for it. This is going to be mostly theoretical with some examples, and then you'll see an exhibition debate later on. I highly recommend everyone goes to the exhibition debate, although if you're super keen, you can probably jump into one of the practice debates. As you can see up on the slide, you should sign up to Pro-Am and Free Hills. There are next internal tournaments coming up. Pro-Am amateurs will be paired with a somewhat pro who will help you out and do these kind of things. It goes for 2 weeks. And then Free Hills is the premier BP internal, which is a bit more competitive. So, we're going to be going through these 5 things today. What's new, what's different, how do you win, what are the different things you need to do in your speech, and what is a point of information, which is probably the biggest difference between these two formats. Why? We basically do BP because Worlds is in BP. The World Uni Debating Championships, which happens over the new year every year, is in the British parliamentary format. Back in the day, it used to change formats depending on the host country. So if it was in America, they'd do it in American style. If it was in Australia, you'd do it in Austral style. They decided that was dumb because it changed every year, and so now we just do it in BP. It makes sense. It's probably the best format, or at least it's very competitive and interesting. So, also, if I'm speaking too quickly at any stage, someone please tell me. What's new? The first one is the big one. Instead of 2 teams, you've got 4. 2 of them will be on one side, 2 of them will be on the other side. It'll make sense later. You have points of information. That is the opportunity to stand up and interject in the middle of an opposition person's speech. They have to accept your interjection, and they may not, but it basically is the opportunity to interrupt someone and ask them a question. You win in a slightly different way. Instead of just proving you're the best, you've also got to prove you're better than the other team that's also on your side. So it's a little bit more complicated. Some of the jargon is different. You might say members of the House or Mr. or Madam Speaker instead of ladies and gentlemen. The first speaker isn't called the first affirmative, they're called the Prime Minister, and instead of speaking about the affirmative and negative, you might talk about that side of the House and this side of the House. It's all a big pretend game because it's meant to be like it's in a parliament where there are different sides of the House and you've got the opposition and the government. You'll get to use that quickly. Prep time is cut in half. There's only 15 minutes of prep time. Speaking time is down to 7 minutes. At the end of the day, though, it's still a debate. The reason why there are 4 teams, which I only learnt when I was producing these slides, is because it's based on a Westminster Parliament. That means it's like a coalition government and a coalition opposition. The same way you've got the Liberals and the Nationals kind of aligned against the Labor and the Green. They're on the same side, they're arguing the same thing, but they will argue it in a different way. And so you'll have 2 different sides arguing the same side of a topic, but they're each kind of trying to do a better job of each other. They're consistent with each other, but they're also competing for the same voters. That's the idea. This is what it looks like from a bird's eye perspective. You speak from the stage. Opening government and closing government are the 2 teams that are on the affirmative. They'll speak for the motion. Opening opposition, I stuffed up. Opening opposition and closing opposition are on the negative side. They'll speak against the motion. The adjudicator sits at the back. Does that all make sense? Can everyone kind of visualize it? These are the 8 people who speak. Prime Minister, Opposition Leader, Deputy Prime Minister, Deputy Opposition Leader, and that's zigzagging across. So you see the acronyms I've used there, OG, OO, CG, and CO. Get used to them, they're very common. Opening government, opening opposition, etc. So you go through the minister, and then the deputy, and then the member, and then the whip. And there's one on the government and one on the opposition for each side. Otherwise, it's just like 3 on 3. You alternate. One from the affirmative, one from the negative. Except for this time, it's one from the government, one from the opposition. All make sense? Alright, this is very fancy. This is Sam Whitney's animation of how it works. So this is 3 on 3. But wait, we changed the names. But wait. We cut the people in half. And then double them. See, how good is that? Oh, no. Looks a lot better on my screen. I copied and pasted them from his slides, so it didn't work that well. Basically, that's how it works, though. It's just reiterating material I went through before. Is that all clear to everyone? No? Does anyone have any questions, then? If anything is unclear, point it out. Basically, there are 4 teams. 2 of them will argue one side, 2 of them will argue the other side. They've got different names. And this is the order in which they'll speak. So you kind of alternate across. Any questions? All right. Yep. Yep. Same deal with that. Okay, so what do? Obviously, like, you're debating, and so you're trying to win. Let's talk about the different speaker roles, though. For the opening half, it's really similar to a 3-on-3 debate. You set up the context in which you think the motion occurs. You talk about a definition, a model, a team split. You set up the clash. You have arguments, and you spend your time rebutting. Does all of that make sense? It's similar. Yep. Yeah. So some of this stuff you won't need to explicitly say, but you have some arguments at your first speaker and some arguments at your second speaker. And so that's really your first 2 speakers. The first one's like a first affirmative. The second one's like a second affirmative. First negative, second negative. Really, really analogous there. One of the different things you might do, and that's called matter grabbing, is you might try and cover more material than you would normally. Like in a debate, you might try and talk about every single possible thing you could imagine, so that your closing half, the member and the whip who are speaking after you, will run out of material. Because you've got to remember, you don't just beat the teams on the other side, you've also got to beat the team that's on your same side. Yeah, so the adjudicator will judge which one of the 2 teams was most persuasive in arguing their side. Out of all 4. So it's a little bit more complicated in that sense. So you've not only got to do a good job of arguing your side and beat the other team, you've also got to do a better job than the other people who are trying to do the same thing.
So it's like having 2 debates with an affirmative and a negative, and then whether out of those 2, what's your price?
Yeah, but the second debate extends from the first debate. So the second debate happens after the first one, and so you can't just reuse the same material. It's not like you have 2 debates repeating themselves. This will start to make more sense. And the important thing to understand is this is complicated than you. You'll definitely get the hang of it. Everyone was in this period once. It was very confusing for everyone once. You watch the exhibition debate and it'll make more sense then. Yeah.
How do you know, let's say you're like one of the last people, how do you know like the first people on your side are going to screw you over by taking all possible options?
Alright, yeah. Well, they'll probably try to. You just got to come up with other stuff. We'll be talking more about that later. What should the closing do then? Closing should still support the opening. They can't contradict them. And so if your opening government stands up and says something crazy, at closing government, as the government member, you can't stand up and say they were dumb. You've just got to agree with them. That's similar to the government. You don't see backbenchers standing up and saying the Prime Minister's an idiot, even if they might want to. If they do that, if a closing team does contradict the opening team, that is referred to as knifing. That's a bad thing, as the name would indicate. What closing teams do have to do, and what I indicated there, is extend the debate. There's already been 2 speeches that were arguing the same side as you, and so in your speeches, you've now got to argue that same side, but in a different way. You have to extend it into new material. This might be talking about things that haven't been talked about there, so different stakeholders. It might be analysing things better. It might just be debating better. If you can just do a better job of it, it'll sound like you've extended the debate, and that's fine. Or you could twist it. Maybe it was theoretical in the first half, you can make it exclusively practical, or vice versa. In some way, you've got to extend the debate. This is the most complicated bit about BP, so if that makes a little bit of sense, you're going well. If it doesn't, don't worry. You've still got to rebut, though, and you've still got to have a clash between the different sides. It's the same as normal debating in that sense. So, what is an extension? How does one extend a debate from the closing half? You can be new, distinct, you can narrow in on something in particular, but most importantly, you've got to be important. You've got to try and argue that your material is the most important in the debate. And so the opening half will have stood up and made what they think is a good case. You've got to stand up and say, yeah, that was a good case, we agree with them. What we think is a more important reason why we're correct is insert reason here. and you can come up with a couple. Normally they're packaged together as an extension. So there are a number of ways you can do this. You can give deeper analysis on a certain issue and go into it in more depth and give more examples or like knowledge or like anything like that. You can repackage stuff, and this is a little bit dodgy. You can basically take what they've done, say it again in fancier words or with a different title, and make it seem like it's your material. You can like try and steal the material from the opening half. Basically, you get an extra half an hour to think. The thing you've got to realise about BP is the opening government has only got 15 minutes after they've first heard the topic to give their first speech. It's not a lot of time. And so the closing half will have had an extra half an hour to think about this, like slightly over an extra half hour, because they'll have the 4 7-minute speeches, slightly under, before them to think, and they got that opportunity to try and extend the debate. So, an example of this, because I understand that's a little bit confusing. In the Melbourne Mini Grand Final last year, which is probably the highest quality British parliamentary tournament in Melbourne, it's a warm-up tournament for Worlds every year, happens after exams in semester 2, so like sometime late November, December. The Grand Final topic was something on the lines of, this House believes that feminists should not criticise female performers who use their sexuality to get ahead, or something like that. And it was basically like, it turned into the Miley Cyrus debate. Like, should feminists criticise Miley Cyrus for dancing up on stage with Robin Thicke in like a provocative way as being against the aims of feminism, or should they embrace her into the fold? Obviously, like lots of different arguments were going back and forth, and the opening half, between the opening government and the opening opposition, they spent a lot of time arguing about whether this was a good thing for feminism, like whether she was owning her own sexuality or whether she was being submissive into the patriarchy, and all kinds of conversations like that. And that was fine. What the closing opposition did, and this was Chris Biss and Nell Jones from Sydney, Chris formerly from Monash, and what they did well to win the debate was they were like, cool, that was fine. You guys had a really good debate. We agree with the opening opposition. We think this was bad performance. You shouldn't have done it. But we don't actually care what your answer was, because we think what feminists should do is have an open and frank discussion about what feminism is, and it's a good thing, no matter what the outcome of that discussion is, and that's why they should criticise it. Because they wanted a discussion to happen. They didn't care if the outcome was that Miley was good or Miley was bad, because all of the opening had done is focus on whether Miley was good or bad. They moved the debate away from that. They extended it into an area about why the discussion about whether Miley was good or bad was good in and of itself. And you see how that's an extension of the debate into a different area. And the important thing they could do there is they totally shifted the debate. Like, you can see how they're two different discussions. And if you can spend your time doing that, totally shift the debate, and then prove that's where the important stuff is, that's how you win, as they did do. So, if you go too far away, you definitely do get disqualified. But the topic was that this House believes that feminists should criticise Miley Cyrus, or should criticise female performers for using their sexuality, and so it was deemed to be still within the topic. You don't have to, sorry, I'll take you in a second, you don't have to move away from what was discussed before. You can take it and narrow in, and that's fine too. The important thing is you do something different, and you prove that what you did was better.
Does that extension still have to look back to what was said earlier? You know how in 303 that has like reference
Yeah, not at all. So while you're on the same side, you are not the same team. If you reference their material, it'll look bad. The adjudicator will be like, oh cool, you just used a bit of their argumentation as rebuttal. That just makes them look better. And so as much as possible, closing teams might not even try and talk about their opening. They'll be like, oh yeah, cool, they did some good stuff, but we're way better. Don't listen to them. And they'll try and move them away from the debate. So don't view it, they're just as much your enemies as anyone else in the room. They just so happen to agree with you. The enemy of your enemy is not your friend. Does that make sense? Any questions about that particular extension or extensions in general? So hopefully in the exhibition debate, we will see some good extensions. Who knows, it might be a terrible debate. I don't think it will be though. And I think it'd be a good idea for everyone to try and pinpoint those. So I'll probably be talking about it after the debate. I didn't realise that was zoomed in. Sorry. Do you know how I zoom it out? Oh. You can read most of the words. I should have checked that earlier. But anyway, yeah, in the exhibition debate, try and pinpoint what their extension was. A good closing team will make it clear what their contribution to the debate was. Because without that contribution, they're never going to win, and like they need to prove that they were different for the adjudicator to give them any credit. Alright? Alright, so that was what the opening had to do. Basically like a normal debate. Closing, they've got to extend the debate. What does everyone have to do? The important thing to recognise is that with 8 different speeches, and your team only being a quarter of them, as opposed to 3 on 3 when you're a half of them, it's very easy for you to be ignored. You've got to be active and involved at every stage of the debate if you want to win. How do you do that from opening government or opening opposition? Because once you've sat down, you don't get another chance to speak. That's with points of information. You get to stand up and offer them after you've finished speaking and before you've started. So opening should be focused on, once they've finished, standing up and offering points of information to the closing half and being like, I understand you're trying to talk about like Miley Cyrus in a different way to what we were, but what about what we said? All that kind of thing. And closing can stand up before they've spoken and say, hey, we're going to take this debate in this direction. How about you try and deal with it now? You use points of information to get involved. How do individual speeches work? They're 7 minutes long with a protected minute at the start and the end. A protected minute is a minute in which you cannot be interrupted. No one will offer you a point of information in that minute. The adjudicator will therefore knock once at 1 minute to indicate that your first protected minute has stopped, once at 6 minutes to indicate that you are back in a protected minute and no more points of information can be offered, and then twice at 7 minutes to tell you to shut up. That should be pretty simple. Scoring. So we had a question about scoring before. Scoring is pretty similar to how it works in normal Austral style or the style that you might be used to from school. The average is still 75. The difference though is there is a wider range. Most of the time in Austral style, there's a range between 70 and 80 that's given out. In Worlds, it's between 50 and 100. No one ever really gets scores above like 90 just because that doesn't get done, but people do get scores down around 50 or 51. Don't worry about that though, doesn't really matter, definitely won't happen to any of you. As an example though, at Worlds, the best speaker is somewhere around averaging 85 in every speech, but at Australs, they're averaging about like between 77 and 78. Like I think this year was just under 78. So, just a little quirk, not something you really need to worry about. If you're interested in the breakdown, no longer is it manner, and method, they cut method, and so it's just 50 points to manner, 50 points to matter. Method still matters, you can't like speak with no structure, but it's kind of left implicit. No questions? Okay. I'm going to be getting into that later. If I was going to give these slides again, I'd probably rearrange the order, but that's fine. Yeah, so a split is just standing up and saying, I will be presenting one argument on the role of government and practical outcomes of this model, and my second speaker will be presenting one argument on minorities. You're just splitting material between two speakers. So, it's not a big deal, I wouldn't worry. Like, it's just a little tiddly bit of your speech. Alright, so let's go into a little bit more depth about what you're meant to do at each individual speech. Because a little bit more so than 3 on 3, individual speeches will have more of a clearly defined role. The Prime Minister's speech. Give the context, define the topic, model, split, provide arguments. The opposition leader will set up what they think the clash of the debate is. Note that this might change. What is important and what the two sides disagree about might change when the closing half gets up. Otherwise, same as normal. Rebuttal, arguments, deputy, rebuttal, arguments, deputy opposition leader, rebuttal, arguments.
How do you deal with rebuttal if you're like the third group? Like you want to try and take the debate away from what the previous people said. It's like if you're going to disagree with the premise of the whole debate so far, how can you really rebut against?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Obviously, it's a little bit complicated. Different people do different things. It's something you'll get used to and you'll just be able to make a judgment call about it. Often people, and I'll move on to the next slide because it kind of makes more sense, will give a little bit of rebuttal just to prove that the other side is wrong and then move on to their extension. So they'll kind of buy into the first debate and they'll be like, even if we were in that debate, you didn't win. Anyway, let's move on to the second debate. Often people will do that. Sometimes, when they're not shifting the debate too far away and when their extension isn't like some earth-shattering thing, they will just rebut with their extension. And so I'll say, we're bringing in our extension a feminist analysis of this issue because you guys have just been sexist and ignored it the whole time. By the way, this analysis means that your material was no good. So there's a number of different ways you can incorporate that. It is a little bit more complicated than normal rebuttal because you don't want to spend all your time talking about the opening half because that is time you can't use to change the debate. So, government member. This is the first speaker of the closing government. The biggest thing they've got to do is provide some kind of way to extend the debate. Normally this is called an extension for reasons obvious. Rebuttal, arguments. Those arguments are the extension. Those things are what forms the difference you provide in the debate. Ideally, a government member and an opposition member will be super, super clear about what they changed in the debate. If you don't do that, you're just begging the adjudicator not to give it any credit. If you try and be like slightly like a sneaky and just talk about the same stuff but pretend you've got an extension, as more often than not, the adjudicator will either like notice and say you didn't do anything different, or not notice you've got an extension at all and say again you didn't do anything different. So as much as possible, they've got to be clear about what they're changing. Yeah, no. They're all even. Because the problem with the first two teams is if you've got a really good closing team, they might change the debate in a way you just did not imagine because they've been thinking about it for longer than you had, and you can't speak again once you finish speaking. And there are 4 speeches after you, and that's a lot of different time for the adjudicator to be thinking about different issues and just to forget you. I think statistically, opening government has lost more Worlds Grand Finals than any other position, although Monash is quite good at winning Worlds from opening government, if you see 2011, 2012.
Just out of curiosity, you mentioned can you use PO lines to bring back knowledge
Yeah, it's exactly what you should do. That is your only chance to speak again. And so, sometime, we'll be talking about this more in the POI section, which I think I'm just about to get to. I don't think it was that bad. Let's go touch it on. I shouldn't have included it. Oh, I went past it.
You press revert, you need
Yeah,
to
well, that
fix
was-
stuff and then you press revert rather than press
No, actually, that wasn't.
Alright, the whips, like a third speech, rebuttal. The important thing to notice is the government whip, that's the affirmative last speaker, like a fourth affirmative kind of, but don't call it that, you'll sound like you don't know anything. They're the only person who gets the chance to rebut the opposition extension. If you think about it, the opposition extension is given at opposition member, which is the third last speech in the debate. There's only one more from that side. So the government whip must rebut that extension because no one else is going to do it. If you don't do it, closing opposition has got a really good shot of winning. What the whips should also do, what the whips should focus on doing is what is called whipping the extension. And so that's making the extension seem the most important. The government member or opposition member will have spent the time creating it. You've got to prove why it's the most important. Same for the opposition whip. Alright, POIs. Sorry, before I do that, any more questions on role? What an extension is, what each speaker should be doing. Alright, no questions at the moment? Alright, let's talk about POIs. Sam, what time are we finishing? Awesome. POIs. You can only ask POIs to the opposition. You can't ask them to your teammate, your buddy who's on your own pair. You also can't ask them to the opening half if you're the closing half, or the closing half if you're the opening half. You just can't. Like I said earlier, you can only ask them between the first and the last minute. So there's only a 5-minute period. most POIs will be rejected. The speaker who is standing up there, they've got control of the pulpit, they've got control of the floor, continuing with our kind of house analogy. And so they will just wave you down, or they'll say no thank you, or anything like that if you try and interject them. Every so often they'll accept you. So, how do you offer? I'll go on to how do you accept next. You stand up, basically. You stick out your hand. If you want to be really fancy, you stand up, put your hand on your head, and stick out your hand like that. And that's to like symbolize back in the day when people wore wigs in Parliament. If they wanted to stand up, they had to put their hand on their head, otherwise the wig would fall off. I'm not kidding. And so, like, people still do that. You definitely don't have to. Any way of standing up, as long as it's not offensive or too distracting, but attention grabbing, will work. So you just stand up and stick your hand out is what most people do these days. You should say something along the lines of, point, madam, sir, on that, point of information. Probably don't say anything other than that. Some people, rude people, bad debaters, will stand up and say, like, that's outrageous, or like, on the economy, or on reality, or kind of rude things. You see how they've kind of put their point in there already? Where they're not meant to do that. If you don't get accepted, you don't get to speak. And so you should only say point or point of information. Like, the full title, which you're allowed to say, and I say it sometimes if I want to distract them, is on a point of information, sir, or on a point of information, madam, just because it takes longer. But nothing other than that. You can't stand up and just start speaking. Alright, the final dot point. Offer 5 a speech. You should be up and down often. You watch the exhibition debate, and hopefully they're good at this, or you watch any kind of debate that's on the internet or anything like that, any of the recorded ones, people offer a lot of points of information, and they get rejected a lot. That's not a bad thing. You just got to be standing up there all the time because you want the opportunity to speak. If you're the opening half, it's the best opportunity to get back into a debate. If you're the closing half, it's the best opportunity to get into a debate early. Yeah, so the point is hopefully you will eventually be accepted. But after you get rejected, just sit down, don't offer another one for about 30 seconds or 45 seconds after that. You're not allowed to stand up and down continuously. Being rejected does not look bad though. Do not be like offended or do not think you are losing because you're getting rejected. It's not like that at all. Yeah. So you've got 15 seconds to say whatever you want. So they'll be standing up there presenting their arguments, talking about whatever they want. You've got 15 seconds to give a bit of rebuttal, 15 seconds to give a counter example, 15 seconds to ask them to talk about something you talked about in your speech. Say in the opening government you spent a lot of time talking about children because that was a stakeholder you cared about, but the closing has started talking about society more broadly. You could literally stand up and say, what about the children? So it's during the 7 minutes, between the first and the 6th minute.
They can be interrupted the whole time.
Yeah. Although you're only allowed to interrupt them by saying sir or point or madam, and then if they want the full 15-second soundbite, they'll say yes, and then you'll go. Yeah. I'll answer that in just a second. Let me finish this, but good question. With points of information, write them down. Highly recommend them. Highly recommend to write them down. Because otherwise, and this like happens to literally everyone, you'll stand up and you'll just go, and then say something like that. So don't you think this harms people more than it helps people? Which is like the entire debate in one sentence, right? It's not useful to your side. The other person would just be like, no. Moving on. Like obviously they don't agree because they're on the other side. Ideally, phrase it as a question. If you don't know how to phrase it as a question, just tack, do you agree on the end? Or don't you agree? Alright, now from the other perspective, how do you accept? You do not need to accept all the points of information. You can reject most of them. You reject them by waving down or by saying no thank you. If people are offering you too many, don't stop your speech every time to say no thank you. You'll get too flustered and it'll look unpersuasive. Just start waving. Just wave continuously if you need to. And like if they're getting too crazy, just be like, sit down, I'm not going to take you. Or anything like that. You're in control, you can reject them at any stage. The reason why you do take them though, is because you have to. There's like, you should only ever accept 2 within your speech, and you should accept at least 3 across your team. So that's the 2 of you. One of you can accept 1, the other one should accept 2, and you just have to do that. You do that because from the adjudicator's perspective, it makes you look better. If you can, deliver a stunning speech, being persuasive for 7 minutes, and be interrupted, and answer that interruption with a good answer, just thinking on your feet, then you're going to look like the best debater in the world, right? That's why you accept them, because it gives you the opportunity to look really, really good. Also, because the rules say you have to. So, you should view them as an opportunity to show how much you're winning, but you should also just view it as an obligation. What you can do, and what I would highly recommend, is waiting until a good place in your speech to take them. Don't take them mid-sentence, don't take them mid-argument. The opposition will stand up at any different stage to try and throw you off. You should say, just either reject them, or say, hold on, I'll take you in a second, and then keep on speaking. Once you've got to a logical place to pause, they'll just be standing there waiting for you. Like I said, you're in control. That's when you say, okay, shoot, hit me, deliver your point, and then you've got the chance when you're cool, calm, and collected to answer. Does that make sense? You can reject them. You will reject 90% of points. You will get the opportunity to make them wait if you want to, because you want to only accept them in good points. Sometimes you'll be against teams, and this will happen quite often in amateur tournaments, that don't offer enough points of information. Like I said, everyone should be offering tons, at least 1 a minute, but that won't happen just because the world isn't perfect. If you get to the end of your speech and you just have not had a single point offered, you can probably say, and I'll take a point from the opposition side if anyone wants to offer one. It's a little bit rude, it's a little bit smart-ass, but I suppose if they haven't offered any, it's the best you can do. Does that make sense? When you're answering them, it's just like any other bit of debating. Prove why they're wrong, somehow. Do it quickly, because at the end of the day, it's a distraction, and you've got the rest of your speech to get back to, but do it well as you can. If you really can't, just be like, yeah, but we think that our stuff is more important, is a good general answer. Obviously make it sound a little bit more eloquent, but I'm sure you guys can do that. Alright, back to offering. What's a good point of information? Short. Don't go more than 15 seconds, preferably go under. Be sharp and be direct. Ideally, you would point out huge mistakes or contradictions in their case. You'd provide a little bit of rebuttal. You would ask them to clarify something. If they've stood up and they've got a 16-point model about how they're going to solve the Israel-Palestine crisis in 3 weeks, you can stand up and ask them to clarify, because that might be a little bit confusing. An example of a good, short, sharp, and direct point of information that was excellent was one that happened a couple of years ago in, it was at Worlds, I think in the quarterfinal or something. It was Amit and Kieran who went on to win, and they were a Monash team. They were debating on the topic that we would, something along the lines of allowing obscene advertising. So the other side had to defend allowing people sexually graphic images being plastered on the side of buses as advertising, or basically having no content restrictions for ads. So you understand how the topic works, pretty out of left field, but also understandable. So they stood. So the other team had this big argument about how they think everyone should be able to see everything. There's no reason why people should be offended. There's no reason why the government should respect being offended. It's all fine. And Kieran stood up and offered a point of information which is along the lines of, would you allow people to have sex in public? Obviously nothing to do with the debate. They didn't have to defend that. But the problem for the other team was, it was if we defend obscene ads, does that also mean principally we should defend people having sex in public? Maybe, maybe not. Who knows? The reason why this was a good point of information is it was confronting, it was sharp and direct, and the speaker was just and then he just literally paused. And this was in the finals of Worlds, and he just paused and he was the audience laughed. And then he was well, if you can prove that it's principally consistent, then sure. And then you see how that's just a not persuasive answer? Basically, you're just trying to make them look bad. Any question you think confuse them, any question, not because it is a confusing question, because it's so stunningly accurate, ideally, any question like that is a good one.
So if you were in that position, would it be just safe to go, yes, we do support that?
Yeah.
They're not going to go and make their case on...
I think that'd probably be the best answer. Most of the time when people point out principal inconsistencies, so when most of the time people argue that something you've done is inconsistent with something else, you can just be sure, debating is principally inconsistent, deal with it. That's a pretty reasonable response. Anyway, that was a good example of a POI because it had a good effect. The person lost the track of their speech, They didn't seem persuasive, more likely to help you win a debate than anything else. The final dot point there is about closing. Closing teams. Obviously, closing teams are going to have some kind of an extension. They'll maybe have brainstormed this, but they've got to make it up a little bit on the fly because they don't know what the opening half is going to be doing. Once they have decided where they're going to extend, they can do what's called flagging, and that's when they stand up during the opening half and offer a point of information to the opposition, and basically in that 15 seconds introduce their extension. If they're going to be extending into feminist theory, they can stand up and say something along those lines, just to make it clear and to move the debate there earlier. Do you see why you might want to do that? Just because you want to shift the debate, and if you can shift it earlier, that's beneficial for you. And as an example, while the deputy opposition leader is speaking, so that's the fourth speaker in the debate, the last one from the opening opposition, the closing government might stand up and offer a POI that flags their extension. The reason why this is usable where is if you do it too early, your opening can steal your material. If you do it to the opposition leader, there is still another opening government speaker, the Deputy Prime Minister, to speak after that. And so if you talk about feminist theory, all of a sudden, wow, surprising, the Deputy Prime Minister has a new substantive point that you wanted to have in your extension. You see why you've got to be careful about those kind of things? Don't do it too early, basically, or don't make it too obvious. Alright, hopefully one of the teams in the exhibition debate does that tonight. I'll be sure to point it out if it happens. To be honest, it's probably not the most important thing. It's just a thing you can do it's a thing you can do from the closing, if you're in the closing government or the closing opposition, to use a point of information to introduce your extension early. Depends what it is. Probably like both would work. We'll skip over that. Alright, let's talk about the different teams and what's different about them. Because more so than in 3-on-3, each of the different teams is a different beast. And you'll find some people, some pairs, who are good at being opening government but won't be good at closing opposition because you need different skills. Opening government. They don't get much chance to respond. It's like a first affirmative and a second affirmative. Only the second speaker does any rebuttal. All they get to rebut is the first quarter of the opposition bench. So they're really unresponsive, unless they use POIs. What they do need to do is cover as much of the debate as possible. If they can talk about absolutely everything, then there isn't room to move away from them. They're always going to be relevant. From opening government, if you stay relevant, you win. The danger is being shut out because you're no longer relevant. Opening opposition. They get the best opportunity on the converse to be responsive because they get the first chance to poke holes in the government case. The danger there is they can't be too negative. They've got to have their own substantive material as well of why the negative side is the correct side. Closing teams, like I said, need to have extensions. Closing government, they've got a special role because also, like I said, they're the only ones to rebut closing opposition. On the inverse, closing opposition, not many people respond to you. Literally only one speaker, maybe for 2 or 3 minutes in their speech. If you think about it, you've got 45 minutes to think of a good extension. They've got 2 or 3 minutes to respond to it. Like, you can hopefully shift the debate far enough away that they don't have time to respond to it. So you see how all 4 of the different teams are trying to do something slightly different with the debate? They're trying to win in a different way. Opening teams by staying relevant and canvassing all the material. Closing teams by doing the opposite, by moving the debate away and proving this a more important direction for it to go in. There are differences. Watch the exhibition debate and try and pinpoint those. What should you be doing in prep? Opening teams, just like normal, prepare a really good case. Closing teams, don't spend all your time thinking of one extension, because if you only think of one extension and then the opening team takes it, you're sunk. You've just wasted 15 minutes. Probably more if you didn't find out till later. So, in the 15 minutes of prep time, after you've heard the topic, the closing teams should focus on thinking of a number of different angles of attack, or a number of different things to think about. Maybe fleshing out a couple of them and spending some more time writing full speeches, but these should only be drafts. You'd only have like possible arguments put in there. You don't spend all 15 minutes on just one extension or one idea, because if it's taken by the opening, you're stuffed. And then once you've got a list, you can sit there in the debate and as the opening talks about things, you just cross them off. You should only be left with a couple of things. The end. That was confusing. Understandable. Don't stress. Does anyone have any questions?